Hello there. Welcome to Women on the Move, and thank you so much for being with us. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Stryker Center. Today, I have the great pleasure of interviewing Ann Leary, best-selling New York Times author of 4 novels and 1 memoir, and recently her novel, The Good House, was adapted for the screen, and it was a terrific movie starring Susan Sarandon and Kevin Kline. As always, I'd like to thank the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for the support of this series. And also, as usual, please write your questions in the chat feature of Zoom, and we will get to as many as we can. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Ann.
Well, thank you, Marjorie.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. And I just wanted to make a little correction. So it was Sigourney Weaver who was in The Good House, not Susan Sarandon, although Susan would have been great.
Sorry, I did see the movie and liked it very much. I
Thank
get them a little confused, but that's correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk to you today. We're here today to talk about The Foundling, a book that I love. And I'm very, very happy that we get to speak about it. So for those, it takes place in 1927 at a home that you will tell everyone the name of. It's primarily about eugenics. It's a historical novel. And for those of you who haven't read it, tell us about the world you created.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. So The Foundling is about 2 women. They were childhood friends. They were raised in the same orphan asylum, as they were called in those days. And they meet again as young adults, but now they're no longer roommates. Mary is the secretary to the very dynamic and very accomplished female doctor who runs the place. And Lillian is an inmate held against her will at an institution whose purported purpose, or its practices, are kind of at odds with what its purported purposes. So let me just say that. In short, Mary works at a eugenics asylum. She didn't go there thinking it was anything but a eugenics asylum, because in the early 20th century, eugenics was very much embraced. It was the kind of a household word, and it was the law of the land, which I will talk about a little bit later. But I knew nothing about that when I started to think about writing this novel. Well,
I'd like to talk a little bit about Mary, main character, who I understand is based on a relative of yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have had a grandmother who I didn't know very well, and I knew she was an orphan. I knew she was raised in a Catholic orphanage in Scranton, and I didn't know how she became an orphan. I didn't know what happened to her parents. And like probably many of you who are watching, I joined Ancestry, over a decade ago, very excited to learn about all these, like many generations earlier ancestors. But one of the first things I wanted to find out was just, how come my grandmother was an orphan? That stopped me for about 10 years. I still don't know I don't know why my grandmother, I don't know what happened to her mother. I wasn't able to find anything about her orphanage. She doesn't have a birth certificate. The first record of my grandmother, whose name was Mary Rauschmeyer, she was working in 1927. Oh, no, actually it was 1930. I made it 1927 in the book, but she was in a 1930 census record. At age 17, she was a secretary at a place in Pennsylvania called, according to the census record, the Nettleton State Village for Feebleminded Women. So it's very not the nicest sounding name of a place. It seemed pretty offensive. But I, of course, Googled it, and I found out that it wasn't even the whole name. It was actually, in those days, it was actually called the Nettleton State Village for Feeble-Minded Women of Childbearing Age. And I learned that it was those last words of childbearing age, which were the most important for the name of the asylum. It's what got it a lot of funding and a lot of attention, because Nettleton State Village in those days was a eugenics asylum, one of many in this country at that time. Its purpose was not, first of all, feeble-minded, I also found out, was a clinical term. It wasn't a slur. It was a way they categorized people who had intellectual disabilities. There were basically 3 levels of disability, being mentally disabled. One was, the lowest was idiot. These were clinical terms, and I had to put a preface because they're so hard to hear. this is what doctors, these were what they were called. So a person who was an idiot would be be the lowest functioning type of inmate in a place like the place where my grandmother worked. There weren't very many there. Imbecile was a person with kind of middle level of disability. And from my research into the place where my grandmother worked and others like it, I came to understand a lot of these people probably just had learning, might have dyslexia or something. They were very, able people. But the highest ranking and the most people at the asylum where my grandmother worked were the morons. So that they were also called the morally, they were mentally and morally disabled. And it was something like 80% of the women when my grandmother was working there were of the moron class, which was people who were women who were appeared normal to most people, but had, but were morally degenerate. And in that time, it was the eugenics move, the eugenics kind of the science of eugenics was kind of very much how, it was the law of the land, basically. And the idea was to keep these morally defective people from having children because criminality was tied in with feeble-mindedness. And so my grandmother worked at a place where they warehoused women, most of whom might have been bad girls. Some of them were young teenagers who accused maybe an uncle of touching them inappropriately. Some of them were, their husbands were tired of them and said, my wife's a little slow. There were many reasons women ended up in a place like the one where
Men
my
could just
grandmother
lock up these women, just say one sentence, and the women were sent to a place like this.
A place like this, or this. So where my grandmother worked, it was for people with what we now call intellectual or developmental disabilities. But so it was different than an insane, person with, a person who has schizophrenia might be sent. But a husband could send a woman to a place like that too. Women had no autonomy at that time. Men were there. Even after women got the vote in 1920, their husbands, until the middle of the 20th century, many people in the audience probably know, men were in charge of the finances. They had the credit cards. They got custody of the children. In the case of a divorce, it was hard to get a divorce in those days. If you weren't married, if you were like my grandmother and you were poor and without a family, the government assumed responsibility of you, even when you were an adult, and would decide whether you should be allowed to have children, or not, or do any number of things. Of course, I'm talking the place where my grandmother worked. It was most of the women there were not from wealthy families, and the 1920s is a time I always associated with, Zelda Fitzgerald and this kind of decadent age of people getting drunk. It was for certain people, the rich people. If you were wealthy and you might be gay or just have lovers and not be married or like to get drunk all the time, you might be considered, wonderfully eccentric. But if you were poor, you were considered a menace to society because this behavior indicated something was wrong with you. And you might, because of your loose morals, bear children that, will inherit them and ruin our country for good.
Well, with that as a background, eugenics, right. Margaret Sanger, who would love to talk about in a few minutes, with this as a background, and you had never written historical fiction before.
Right.
How did idea to reality?
Thank you. Yeah, so I often get veered off of my book to talk about it.
It's such a great topic, though.
It is. So, originally I thought I raced, I was finishing another novel. As soon as I finished it, I raced in the middle of a snowstorm. And I went to central Pennsylvania, to Harrisburg, to the state archives. I wanted to find out everything about this place. I went to the actual asylum. I couldn't go in, but I went and looked, and I really looked up some county records and some city records, lots of newspaper archives. I wanted to find out everything I could about the place where my grandmother worked. But during my research online, I found out there were so many other similar asylums in our country, throughout North America. There were lots in Canada and in Europe. And Great Britain was where actually the eugenics movement started. Francis Galton he was the nephew of Charles Darwin. He coined the term eugenics. Eugenics is kind of a Latin, I think it means well-born. But anyway, I decided so originally I was going to do a journey of finding out about this place and what I discovered, and more of a journalistic thing. But when I found stories about, I became very fascinated by stories about some of the women who ended up in these places. And I thought I wanted to just tell this, I wanted to kind of condense them into one story. And so I decided to write a novel. And so in this novel, there are people, the main character, who's the narrator, is loosely based on my grandmother, but I don't know. My grandmother apparently never told anyone what happened where she worked, or what kind of place it really was. And and the records have been, in the words of one of the people who worked there in the later years, when it became a much better place. But somebody said they purged early records. Purged was the word that was used. So, I couldn't, all I could, so I had to kind of, the plot is mine, but I will say that nothing that happens in this book, as far as atrocities that happen to the women or girls who lived there, who were called inmates, I certainly didn't make it worse. In fact, I had to keep some of the stuff out of the book. It was too awful to actually, some of the stuff I found out was just too awful to put in the book. So yeah, that's what it was. I loved writing it. I still am fascinated by it. Probably, I don't think a week goes by that I don't look up or find something else about the eugenics movement and about these asylums that I want to learn more about. So
I have learned a lot in hearing to talk to you, and I find it fascinating myself. So you have basically, let's say, what I wanted to talk to you about is this. You wrote historical fiction, and the main character, let's say her name is the main character, there are three, but let's start with Mary. She was very full of the attitude of her day. I love that she was not somebody in the 2000s. I mean, she was a woman, a girl who lived in the 1920s, 1930s. So did we root for her? We weren't so sure at the beginning, right?
That was a struggle because, it was hard to like Mary, if you're from our time, I think it was hard for me I worked hard on that because certainly early reads, I did get notes back. It's like, how Mary's so awful. So she is not woke. She is of her time. Yes. And even from being of her time, she's not doing, there's reason not to like her, especially, I'll just explain, a little bit more about the plot. She loves her job. It's an amazing job for a woman who, had a very grim childhood, and a childhood that actually had some very serious trauma involved in it.
But she's only 18 years old. That's important.
Right. Yeah. And my grandmother was 17 when she was there, but I think she's about to turn 18. But yeah, so she's very young and naive. She was raised by nuns, so she wasn't given a very worldly outlook, and so she arrived here, and it was very the place where my grandmother worked is right near Bucknell. In fact, my grandmother met my grandfather, who was a student at Bucknell, and that's why I'm here today. But Bucknell, the place where my grandmother worked, was quite beautiful at first glance, and you can find it online, pictures of it. There was something called the Kirkbride Cottage plan that was coming into vogue then for asylums. They didn't want these Victorian Gothic, horrible looking asylums anymore. They wanted places that looked, nicer. So if you squinted and didn't really see the bars on the windows, you might think you were on a campus. It was pretty, but so was the eugenics movement, the way it was presented to the public. There was not much to object to. So I was, so. Anyway, what was your question, Marjorie?
Well, the question was about Mary, but I would love to talk about the three main characters. So Mary is 17 years old. She's living with her aunt, I believe. She just was raised in a nunnery, and she goes to a function, an event, and she meets this woman, Agnes Vogel, full of 40, but she's sophisticated, and I'm telling your story, but she's sophisticated and she's beautiful, and she's basically never seen a woman like that. So she's a bit of a mother figure for her, I thought.
Yes.
So she's very taken with her. So my question to you is, why did Agnes Vogel hire this young, naive girl? That's primarily my main question.
Okay.
What did she see in her?
Well, for one thing, I think it was, she didn't, I think that, it was a very rural part of Pennsylvania where the asylum was built. And So there were, Mary, my grandmother apparently was taught, received some vocational training and was just taught stenography and secretarial skills. So I don't know. I would love to know how she got this job. I don't know. But in the novel, I very much believed, and it was kind of a theme throughout, was Mary's motherlessness, and Lillian, her friend, is something that's very core to her being. And then Dr. Vogel, as a psychiatrist, one of the first, female psychiatrists in the United States, because women didn't go to usually medical school in the United States. But not just that, you learn later she's got maybe some sociopathic traits, but she sees in Mary a whole, which is this motherlessness, and she is able to use that to manipulate Mary. But also I think there's a hole in Dr. Vogel, and she doesn't have children, and she doesn't have, so she wants someone, she's very narcissistic and wants to, kind of create someone in her form, and she sees the possibility of that in Mary. So those two characters, Dr. Vogel is loosely based on a female doctor who ran the place where my grandmother worked.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Who's that based on exactly?
Well, I hate to say, because I don't know, this woman has living family, and nothing the character of Dr. Vogel does in the book is based on this real doctor. But people did question the real doctor who ran the place, but her name was Dr. Mary Wolfe. And when I first found her through my research, I was very, very impressed. I felt like Mary, and I wanted the reader to kind of learn, meet Dr. Vogel the way I did online. She was a suffragist. She went to medical school in 1899 when few women went to college. She was running this huge asylum and writing, public health reports for elected leaders before she had the right to vote. So there was a lot to her that I admired, and then I found out not just her, but other people who ran institutions like this, which were often profiting off of the work of the inmates, and profiting off the misery of the people who were there. They were supposed to be taken care of.
Well, your characters are so interesting. They're so nuanced. They're good, or are they bad, or are we supposed to root for them, or are we not supposed to root for them? I found that part of it interesting. And, when we make a movie out of this, or I'm sure it's optioned and it's going to be fantastic, I could see Meryl Streep. Maybe,
so many people tell me who they thought.
Little bit like The Devil Wears Prada, a little bit.
Right. Well, so you're right in that Dr. Vogel is the most exciting character that an actress would want to play, I think, because women don't usually, and I liked writing her for this reason, women don't usually get to be an anti-hero. And who's the most exciting person in a movie or in a novel is the person who is a villain, but who is a full-formed human being. They have good attributes, as everybody does, and bad. And so I wanted to explore that. And yeah, she was fascinating to me to write. And, so and then Lillian, the third main character, was definitely, based on multiple very tragic stories. I learned not just, again, about the place where my grandmother worked, but similar places. These young women, it was very, I would find myself, tearing up reading about, I'd find a case. So in some cases, parents were able to afford a lawyer to bring a habeas corpus case against Nettleton State Village. They would say, my daughter's not feeble-minded. I prove all the neighbors know her. She might have been arrested for doing something, drinking, which is illegal, or maybe prostitution in a very poor industrial state. Very not uncommon for young women to make some money that way. The prison sentence for that was a year, but sometimes after that year at Muncie State Prison for Women, the girls would then be sent to Nettleton State Village, where you had to stay till menopause. You didn't go there for any sentence. If you went there at 14 or you went there at 40, you left when you were no longer able to have children, because the purpose of the place was not to help or teach the inmates. It was to keep them. It was from having children. Some states, maybe people know, they had approved forced sterilization of feeble-minded people. but Pennsylvania was one of the states that that wasn't legal, and they did instead put them in institutions. So Lillian was one of these women. So I was reading through these cases. I'd find a woman who's 18 years old in 1920, and her family tried to get her out, and the judge said no because he was friends with the Mary, very powerful family, I believe. And then I'd see her. So in 1920, she was 18, and then in 1930, she's 28, and 1940, she's 38, and it broke my heart. I saw these lives of these young women just on each decade, getting older, being in prison, and they weren't, as I said, they were put to work. Most asylums and most prisons were work farms. It was they were self-supporting. They had farms that fed everybody there. The girls, the women at where my grandmother worked the fields. They cleared forests. They did all the work of the asylum, cooking, cleaning, feeding everybody, and they took care of the truly intellectually disabled women. There were very few paid employees, a lot of unpaid employees. They also would send the higher functioning girls to local families to work as housekeepers or nannies, and their wages were paid to the asylum. And it was believed at that time that these girls owed the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for imprisoning, for keeping them.
But they did feed them. They basically paid, right? They paid it back in their work. They were fed.
Right. They had, they were in debt to the place that they didn't want to be. So so all of it was fascinating. There was so much I learned. Prohibition was part of the real story and became part of my novel. It was fascinating time. It was my first historical novel. Now I know why people write historical fiction. It felt like cheating. So much of my plot was informed by things I found out about the time. I did originally have a 450-page draft. I had a wonderful editor, Mary Sue Rucci, who helped me decide. She would say, that might be interesting to you. It doesn't belong in this story. It's a rabbit hole. So.
Well, for everyone, in case you haven't read it, the main plot are these three women. So Mary is very happily working in the office, very happy. Agnes is in charge, and then she sees Lillian, someone she grew up with. And I love that became your main plot, now has a problem.
Conflict,
about her main conflict. Correct. What does she do about her friend? If she helps her, she could potentially end up there herself, correct?
That's right. So I really wanted the reader to see that it was just there, but for the grace of God, go on in each other, certainly from Mary seeing Lillian. But while I was writing this book, we were at a time in our country where a lot of things were happening that reminded me so much of what so the 2020s were so similar to the 1920s. Every day I was reading headlines that pretty much echoed headlines I was reading about at the time. And a lot of what it had to do with was xenophobia, immigration, which was a huge part of the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, and fear of the other, so I really used that in, and also the way one kind of justifies their beliefs by blaming others, other blamers. So Mary had a very traumatic incident in her childhood, and Lillian was part of it a little bit, and Mary was able to somehow make it Lillian's fault, and actually was able to convince herself, and I do believe she believed she was right in that perhaps Lillian belonged where she was. Lillian was sent there because she was working as a jazz singer. She fell in love with a horn player. He was Black, and she had his child out of wedlock, which was against the law to have any child out of wedlock. It was very much against the law to have to have an interracial sexual relationship. So she was sent there and removed from her child. And so anyway, there was a lot brought in about, I had to write Mary as a person who would be of her time, who was very appalled by that, but also there was this fear of Lillian revealing the secret from Mary's past, which was very shameful and certainly would have landed Mary in a similar institution. Women were very vulnerable at that time. So
Right. Now,
That
you
was,
also brought in a little bit of anti-Semitism. You brought in everything.
yes, well, of course, because that's what the eugenics movement. So
Right.
if, I didn't know much about eugenics, and if you're watching this and you didn't know about it, you're not alone. We weren't taught in the United States in public schools anyway about eugenics. I learned about it when my daughter wrote a paper for her women's history class in college. But if you want to learn more about it without reading all the books that I read, the PBS does this series, which many of you probably watch, American Experience. And several years ago, they did, I think it was a 2-part episode. It was called The Eugenics Crusade. I just looked at the ad for it, so you can stream it. And it has a subtitle, which I just noticed today. I'd never noticed before. It's called The Eugenics Crusade, What's Wrong with Perfect? And then the picture for the ad for this show are these identical, like Aryan boys with blue eyes. It's very boys from Brazil, if people know what that is. So in this, do watch this, because they very well condense everything I learned into a very understandable and interesting hour or two. I think it's maybe 2 hours. Basically, they explain that even though many of us don't know what eugenics was, in the 1920s and the 1930s, eugenics was a household word. It was everyone, there was something in it for everyone. And positive eugenics is something people can kind of wrap their minds around. I mean, it's simply encouraging families that are thriving and healthy and can afford more children to have more children, and families that are struggling, have too many children, maybe aren't physically well, to have less children. And that is sort of what was going on in European countries, Canada, and the United States. The United States was the first country to move to negative eugenics, which would be the forced sterilization of those who were deemed inferior or the institutionalization of them. Anti-Semitism is very much a part of it, because we had a law that was very much a eugenics law, which was the Immigration Act of 1924, which was a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to all the immigrants that were coming in after the First World War. But they were coming from the wrong parts of Europe. They were coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. They were Catholics and they were Jews. They were coming from Asia and all over. So this law, many people probably know, that's the one where they would only allow a very small percentage of immigrants from those countries. And I'm not sure. And people say that's what kept Anne Frank's family. That certain law is what kept her family from coming. I don't know specifically any details on that, but it certainly kept a lot of Jewish and others from coming. And Hitler in Mein Kampf. So before the Nazis even took power, Hitler wrote in his book Mein Kampf about the American eugenics movement, and specifically cited the Immigration Act of 1924 as being wonderful, and thanking American eugenics leaders for understanding the need to keep inferior races from reproducing. So it's very much a dark stain in our history. I do think our eugenics movement came to a screaming halt at the end of World War II, because the final solution of eugenics is the Holocaust. I think it's not a big leap to go from the government deciding that you can't have children, or you can't have taking your reproductive ability away from you, to deciding that you're not really human, because that's not very, you're almost like a livestock if you're able to do that, determine who can breed. I think that's what happened. I do think in that I've never read any determinative thing of why eugenics suddenly was not ever talked about again, but I do think that had to have been the case.
Well, so primarily men made these laws, right?
Oh, yes.
Margaret Sanger, right in there. And then, of course, you have a parallel to today with the.
Yeah, so many parallels. There was an article I read that was written in the 1920s, and a senator was making a joke, and he said, "I wish we could build a wall around the country." And I thought, and it was very much, I feel like today's MAGA people believe, so Make America Great Again, I believe they thought the early 20th century was when America was great. But in the early 20th century, there were MAGA people who thought it was already not great. And they were hearkening back to another time, a time when what they called the Native Americans were mostly, took up most of the population. What they meant by Native Americans were English, Dutch, some German Americans. They were not true Native, what we think of as Native Americans. So, I mean, I don't want to bore everybody, but it's a very fascinating
It's a great
subject.
topic. But then you have a woman like Margaret Sanger. She was progressive,
Right.
she was a reformer, and she was a proponent of this movement. They want to, I don't really follow much with Planned Parenthood, but they want to take her name off.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. So I believe Margaret Sanger, I actually, there's a quote from her at the beginning of the book, talking about imbeciles and morons. But Margaret Sanger, in my view, has been very much vilified in recent years. She did start Planned Parenthood. She got her hands dirty. She was a middle-class woman who went into the tenements in New York and helped women who were dying, giving birth to their 10th child. She wanted to help. She was a eugenicist, but what people don't understand, she was a racist, certainly by today's standards or by any standards. But what people don't take into account is many people that you admire very much were also outspoken eugenicists. Everybody from Theodore Roosevelt to Virginia Woolf, Alexander Graham Bell, and every every titan of our, society or business titan. They were embraced this. There was something for everyone, as I said earlier. If you were a farmer, you understood. You definitely would choose to breed your prize bull to a healthy cow. You wouldn't and so they understood it. And certainly very wealthy people liked it because I think it was in this PBS documentary, which was very fascinating. I think it was Kellogg who felt guilt. Why am I making? They said something like it took him 20 minutes to canter his horse across Central Park, and in those 20 minutes, he earned more than 98% of Americans earned all year, something like that. So some very wealthy people were troubled by this. It didn't seem fair. But then when they learned about eugenics, it made sense to them. It wasn't because it was unfair or anything. They were better people. They were better. They came from better stock. They were smarter. That's what eugenics taught people. So everyone had a reason to, or most people did have a reason to like it or think it made sense, especially when the positive eugenics was more the way.
But your two girls, Mary and Lillian, were brought up by nuns. They didn't really have appropriate education.
No, but interestingly, I learned, so, we've all vilified the Catholic Church for many reasons and for good reasons. The Catholic Church is the only institution that opposed eugenics in its early years because, Catholicism doesn't believe, they didn't believe in birth control. They certainly don't believe in abortion. So they didn't believe they think God, determines when life starts and who would, so I did have a nun as part of the story who I loved, and I made her one of the better characters in the story. She's just a kind of a flashback character, but that was interesting for me to learn too about the Catholic Church. It certainly didn't help. It didn't stick there. They didn't go in but they were the only religious institution. So, not to say that there weren't leaders in every other faith and many people who did oppose eugenics at that time. Some scientists who originally embraced eugenics started to back away from it long before the Holocaust. They started to see that environment plays as much a part in criminality and moral defectiveness as does heredity. So
I took a look at some of the questions on the chat about your book. So we'll start with Darren. When you started writing this book, did you have any worries? Bringing up wrongs of the past can be liberating for some, but can cause hurt for those who might have lived through it. I think you touched a little on that.
Well, that's interesting. So yes, I actually, there's a couple of Facebook groups that are devoted to the place where my grandmother worked, and I joined one of them, and there were people who were members of this group who worked at Nettleton State Village when it, again, as I said, it became a better place. It closed in the 1990s, but it went through major reforms in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and it became a training school for people, men and women, with true intellectual disabilities. And the people I met in this group, and some of whom I've met in person, were very devoted to the individuals who they cared for and loved very much. And they were worried about, I mean, they gave a little pushback. A lot of them didn't know about the early purpose of the place. And, I'm actually giving a talk there in a couple of weeks. So I'm hoping to meet these people. But yeah, I want to say, and I always do say that, this was a place that employed a lot of people in that region, and it ended up the people who have there are people who have great memories of it, and it did help a lot of. It did do some wonderful things for many people. So yeah, I worried about that. And as I said earlier, I don't want to talk too much about the doctor who my grandmother worked for because I've never met her. All I know is what was written about her in newspaper articles, and some of them were written by newspapers that were kind of didn't like her family. And there in those days there was fake news. They were opposing. Yeah, there was each local region seemed to have like a morning edition, one editor. Yeah, then they had different opposing viewpoints. I thought that was interesting too.
This is interesting. Well, a lot of people would like to know. Now we're going to say we'll talk about your body of work and things like that. But Linda would like to know a little bit about your writing process. Well, we know where you started your research. Tell us a little about your process.
Well, so I write, okay, you might see behind me a bed. This is a guest room. It's a little dog on the bed.
That's a very nice room.
So I am, and I'm on a little bed. So this is where I write, and I like to write in the morning. I sometimes do like to write kind of reclined on that bed because it helps I have lower back issues. But I write in the morning. I like to get up early and write. I'm the most, I think I'm most clear-headed and confident in the morning, and that confidence starts to wane in the early afternoon, and then I can't even look at what I've written after 2 or 3 o'clock. So that's my process. I do like if. Sometimes I'm stuck and it's hard to get even, a few hours of work done. But if the book is really moving, which it, eventually, hopefully always will, there'll come a time when the book is almost writing itself, which did happen in this book eventually. You don't want to stop, but I always tell young writers, that's where you stop, because, it's 3 o'clock, stop, because that way the next morning when you come back to it, it's ready, it's going. If you stop, which happens, you can't help it, and you're already like in the doldrums, you're just drifting, there's nothing happening, you come back, it's still there. So I do, there have been times where I've just kept writing into the night, but now I know I try to stop when it's kind of got an engine still going.
If you write into the night, do you ever get up the next morning and throw that all away?
No, because I usually only do that if it's like novelists. That's why I really like writing fiction. I'm sometimes surprised by what happens in a scene. I'm surprised, once I know, I really try to develop the characters first. And once I know them, I really felt this in my book, The Good House, and the main character, Hildy Good. At one point I said to my editor, I feel right now like if you said, write me a scene where Hildy is on the moon, I know how Hildy would behave. I know what she would do. So I feel like once I know these characters really well, then any scene I place them in, I know what they're likely to do. And that creates the scene. And then sometimes things happen that I'm not even expecting to happen. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So you don't have yellow stickies and you know exactly what's going to happen. It just kind of evolves as you're.
I have I'm not an outliner. I do have a sense of what I always have a sense of what's going to happen, what's going to be the resolution of this book and what's going to happen to these characters and what it's about, the general theme of the book. But I don't know. I definitely don't do, I'm not careful about outlining.
We're not going to say the ending of this book, but I hope everybody reads it because the ending is spectacular. And you probably knew that, right? You might have had that in your head. Did you?
Well, so the end. I wrote probably 20 different endings of this book. So when I wrote the whole book without, and sent it to the editor, fully formed. I just wanted to get it all out. And it was originally written in the third person, then I changed it to first person, and which I think really helped it a lot, getting inside Mary's head. But when I sent it to her, I said, the ending doesn't work. And then for a year, the ending just didn't work. And then finally we came up with an ending. And then without giving too much away, it was quite there. So I tried this thing, and I was afraid it was gimmicky, and I sent it to my editor, and she was like, I don't know if it's gimmicky, and she showed it around. We decided it worked, and I think people, feedback I've gotten, I guess people are nice to the author, but people seem to like it. But yeah, it's hard. Endings are hard, and that's why, when you watch a great movie and then the ending is horrible, it's because it's hard. They're really hard writing endings.
So let's talk about your other books. I not long ago saw the movie The Good House and read your book, of course, and thought that was really terrific.
Thank you.
So has anything else been made into a film or a series?
I wrote this. The only other thing is I wrote a modern love column years ago, and then Amazon did Amazon TV or Prime,
right.
and
they did little short, right?
They did a series based on the modern love column. They chose certain columns that they really, that had been kind of, people had what did they call it? Viewed over and over again. And so anyway, mine was chosen, and so Tina Fey and John Slattery played the characters. Now, I didn't write the episode. Sharon Horgan, who's very talented, wrote and directed it. So I can't, people will say, well, so Tina Fey played you, but it was not me. Like, it was I wrote I don't even know, are they 1,200 words, modern love columns? It's a very short essay, and she made a half-hour episode about it. So there was stuff that, so anyway, but it was very fun, and I enjoyed it. And yeah.
Well, I think
they even gave my character a different name.
Well, that was my favorite. I watched that. I think that was during the pandemic, and that was my favorite. I like those two characters. So
thank you. I was thrilled when I heard who was cast. It was so fun. Yeah. So, that and those two.
So The Good House. Let's get to that. So
yeah,
that was really a terrific story.
Thank you. Yeah. So that was my first New York Times bestseller. It was. I loved writing that book. It was, if you haven't read it, it's told from the point of view of a woman, set in New England. I moved to New England when I was 14. I moved there from the Midwest, and I've ever since been very fascinated by the New England kind of character, distinctive kind of personality of Yankee New Englanders. And so Hildy is a woman who is very much she's a successful real estate broker, and she may or may not have a problem with alcoholism. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I wanted to explore. I feel like people don't truly understand what denial is, so I wanted to have the main character reveal through her inner kind of, her inner dialogue what it's like to be in denial, and the way a person's not lying when they tell you they don't have a drinking problem. They don't have one. They know they don't. And so I had Hildy, who is the main character, do that. I am a real estate junkie, and so that was another reason I wanted to write about a real estate broker. But she's very good at reading. Finding out, she reads a person's house and she knows everything about that person. And I love that. And that was kind of the launching off of the book. And so, yeah, I think that was a rewarding book. A lot of people still send me emails about how much they love it. I found it was fun. It was, it was same with the Foundling. It seems grim, but I think there were funny. I always try to find humor, and there's always humor in any situation. So, but especially in The Good House, I tried to find some humor, quite a lot of humor in alcoholism.
So in doing this particular series, and I think you're our 43rd author, which is really terrific because it's been about 4 years now. And it feels to me that everybody is friends. All the authors are friends with each other. I have found this. Everybody.
Oh.
So my question, and actually I just met someone last week who spoke about you. So do you have author friends? And
yes.
You all read each other's works? Explain a little about that.
Yeah, I think I was doing this during COVID. We did, I was the moderator for an Alice Hoffman talk, and Alice is a very good friend of mine. And I do have, so when you're a writer, you do go to book festivals or you're on panels. I also, if you live in a community where there are other writers, you usually find them pretty fast. And, it's a different kind of lifestyle. You work every day, but people think you're just sitting around in your pajamas. So it's nice to have friends who are writers. And it's nice to have friends who are generous writers. Alice Hoffman would certainly be in that category, but there are so many others who have helped me in my writing career, who, everything from reading early pages to giving blurbs. We all try to, I try to do that for others. And I have friends who I really count on for doing that. My friend Laura Zigman has a new novel out, Small World, and she's
Laura
one of
was
my
with
best.
us here, and she's just terrific. Yeah.
I love her. She's one of my best friends. So she and I very much, I think, rely upon one another to give us a good read. Like I trust her, and I hope she trusts me too, but we do like to share pages when we don't usually show work to other people. So,
And I was lucky enough to meet Eleanor Littman not long ago, and she
uh-huh.
said hello to you.
Yeah. Oh, well, hello, Eleanor. Yeah. Yeah. So it is, it's fun. It's writers always appreciate. And I too, I do like to moderate because I do want to always talk to writers about their writing process. Alice Hoffman is a great example. She writes so much. She writes so many books and good books. And so her process is always interesting to me. People have different, so I'm fascinated, by the kind of how others writers write and or don't write. Sometimes people are blocked, and that's also interesting too.
So who's your first reader? Do you have one?
No, because my husband, it's only I want him. A person's like a husband or a friend. It's going to read it. It's going to give you a good read once. Then when you show the new drafts, they're going to look at it, but they're not going to. So I don't want him to read a kind of okay draft, because if that's the biggest read he's going to get. I'm just saying, he would probably say he reads but I just like to. I'm kind of a perfectionist, so I do. Often show pages to my mother. She loves to, she's very helpful. She reads a lot of books, and I share with my friend Laura and other friends. But I just really like to have the book in at least, in some kind of shape for people to not feel sorry for me when they do the first read, or like wonder if I have any other skills besides writing.
So today, social media seems to push books. So am I right?
Yes.
I mean, has that changed a lot, the publishing world?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it was, and I certainly haven't been writing as long as some writers, but, I don't even know if Facebook or certainly Instagram didn't exist when I wrote my first book, which was a memoir. But now, apparently, if you're writing a debut novel, for example, the publishers will look at your how many followers you have on Twitter. And it's such a bummer. It's just so not what one thing. I mean, it's sad to think that Edith Wharton, for example, would have been judged on, how many people she sent Christmas cards to. I don't know. Because those
before.
What?
I'm sorry, I interrupted, but how did they do it before social media? The publicists from the publishing company?
I'm told they would actually purchase advertisements and also promote it in, big posters and books. No, they did a lot, but social media is wonderful. It is a great way. It doesn't cost anything. So I'm kind of joking here. Publishers use it in wonderful ways, but they also expect authors to do it, and it becomes tedious to our friends, because my social media, my Facebook, especially, most of them, a lot of they're really my friends. So once I have a book coming out, it's like every day, like, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, look at my book, look at my book. And it feels a lot. It feels, like a braggy thing, but now, or it felt like that probably 2 books ago when we first started. All authors felt uncomfortable with it. Now it's so much part of our culture that it doesn't feel uncomfortable, but it used to. It used to feel very much, why am I bragging about myself all the time? But I think people understand now. It's just, it's how people promote anything. And it's an easy way to.
So somebody came back with a question, let's say, just about your grandmother. Lynn would like to know if your grandmother ever talked to your parents, about those experiences.
Well, apparently no. So my grandmother and my mother did not have a good relationship. My grandmother lived until I had children of my own, but the last time I saw her, I was about 8 years old. My mother had to cut ties with her mother because her mother had a very traumatic childhood and worked at a place like this. And then had a very traumatic kind of adult life too. She ended up being having psychiatric issues in addition to being a chronic alcoholic. And my mother had to cut ties with her because my mother was trying to protect us, her own family, from a person who was very damaged. So I've always been fascinated by my grandmother. That probably added to this story. I wanted to have a relationship with her, but I didn't know what was wrong with her until I was researching this. But my mother said her mother never told her where she worked. She just said she worked for the government, which she did when she met my grandfather at Bucknell. She did work for the government. Laurelton State Village was a state asylum, so she wasn't lying. But it kind of makes her sound like a spy and something wonderful, fun.
Did your grandmother? I missed something here. Did she grow up in an orphanage?
Yes, yeah, she was what they call a half orphan, just like in the novel. So, a lot of people my age, 60, have grandparents who were orphans or half orphans just because of the wars going on and the different lack of penicillin and everything. People died more. And so a half orphan is somebody who has a living parent, but that parent works. So my grandmother had a father who worked. I'm sure he probably had to give money to the orphan asylum, the Catholic orphanage where she was, and she got to visit. So she knew her aunts and uncles and her father, but they didn't take care of her. The foundling, it was named, I didn't know what a foundling was. So, an orphan is somebody whose both of their parents are dead. But everyone, there's a record of who they were. But foundlings are a baby that was literally left at a church or a synagogue or a hospital with a note. And that did happen. And I think happens rarely today too. It's just that no one knows anything about them. And that's who Lillian was in my novel. So, that I thought that was, the girls were fascinated by, they love to fantasize about, if you don't know who your parents were, didn't know they were just poor people in Scranton, they could have been anyone. And so I found that kind of added to Lillian's character. Maybe the girls could make up these exotic reasons.
Well, didn't Mary make up stories about her father and she told the kids different
Yeah, I did do that. That's true. Something in my family and families where there's kind of intergenerational trauma and shame. There's a lot of maybe embellishing of people in their family, embellishing stuff just to make themselves feel better. So yeah, that was, again, something I enjoyed exploring for the novel, was Mary wanting to do that.
Well, it sounds like your own grandmother, the way she was raised, might have colored her relationship with, I suppose, with your mother. And
Sure, she wouldn't have grown up with a mother. She didn't grow up with a family. Not to disparage all nuns, but they're not, in those days, weren't the cuddliest people, and to raise a baby. So yeah.
How long let's get back to your very first book. So what were you doing? You were home?
Oh, so yeah, no. So I studied writing in college. I wanted to be a writer, and I was always writing, but I hadn't had anything published. And my first book was a memoir about my son being born early. It was very premature. My husband and I went to London for what was supposed to be a long weekend, and I went into premature labor, and I had him. And I'd packed for 2 nights, and we stayed for 6 months. My husband is Dennis Leary, who is an actor, and he was a comedian at that time. Nobody knew who he was, but from the minute we got to London, audiences really loved him. And we ended up, it was really the most traumatic time in my life because my son was very premature, but the National Health Service in Great Britain is outstanding, and he got excellent care. And once he got out of the hospital, he couldn't fly yet. We ended up at the Edinburgh Festival. It kind of launched my husband's career. So it's like a fish out of water. It's called An Innocent, Abroad. And Mark Twain is one of my favorite authors, so I stole that title and kind of twisted it a little bit. But it's a kind of fish out of water story. But it's a true story. It's what happened. And then my other books have been novels. And right now I'm working on an essay collection. So I'm going back to kind of mining from my own, having to tell about myself, my own experiences and people I know, which I'm loving, but also, it's hard to be careful about people. So many funny stories I can't tell, but I'm going to try without alienating people.
You definitely answered my next question, which is what you're working on now. And I always like to, first of all, a couple of things. What do you read? Is there anything you can throw out to us? What you're
Oh my God. Well, I really love kind of darker reads. I love like Shirley Jackson, Patricia Highsmith, kind of, I love a gothic. Do people know who Wilkie Collins is? I actually really do read more books, older books, than contemporary fiction, but I do read a lot of contemporary fiction, especially because some of the books are written by friends of mine. But I'm trying to think. Right now, I'm reading a lot of. There's this author from the 1920s named Betty McDonald, and she wrote really funny books. One of them was The Egg and I. And I'm reading it because she's funny and she writes memoir, and I'm writing personal essays, and she's getting my kind of, I'm just getting a feel for that kind of voice, which I love. And I've read all of her books. Some of you older people in the audience will know who she is. And if you don't, and you're young, you might read her. Again, she's of a different era. Some of the things she says are not woke. Please look away and then continue to read.
I have to do this sometimes. So a couple of things as we end. I wasn't looking at this side. I probably were putting up the link to purchase the book, I believe, and that book, this book, The Foundling, that we've been talking about. It's a page turner. You're going to learn a lot, and it's a complete page turner, and the ending is spectacular, as we said. So I also have another question for you. Is there anything you wish you were asked? I sometimes like to know, what did we miss? Anything you'd like to tell us, or?
Oh gosh, no, you asked such great questions. And of course, I always end up talking too much. So, no, I just, I feel that I just am honored to be part of your series. It is a wonderful series. I've caught some of the other authors. I love what you're doing. Actually, I have a question for you. Did you do virtual events prior to COVID?
No, we did not. This series was planned to be an in-person event, an in-person series, and then COVID hit, so we decided to bring it online. It happens to have worked so well that we've done, 42 or 43 authors this way, and we get a very, very nice crowd. People come back. In the fall, for whoever's listening, we're going to do it two ways. We're going to try to do it on the stage with a nice audience. However, it will still be live streamed. So same format, but the option of being there in person. And Anne, I was going to ask you if maybe you'll come. So
I would love to. And I want to say that's one positive thing of COVID. I love that this, so many, you're not the only, group that has been doing this. Like, why that you can reach broader audiences. You have a wonderful program, and so I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm glad you kept the virtual program going, because you can reach more people, I think, and hopefully people buy the books. But most of all, I just like to.
Well, thank you. We think it's worked. We hear from a lot of people that it's become something that they like to watch on Tuesday morning. So if we keep it the same.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
So,
well, Marjorie,
thank you so much. You're wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. It's absolutely fantastic. Wait, last question. Someone said, "How's your dog?" I just want to make sure you get that one in there. How's your dog?
Yes. So my dog, Eddie, follow me on Instagram. That's what I don't post about my books. I post about this rescue dog who is a genius, and he is a difficult dog. He's not the friendliest dog, but it bothers me that he's not viral, because he's very smart and knows some great tricks. There's these trick titles that he's one of them all. And so if you like dogs and like to see dog tricks, Anne Leary on Instagram. And it's not to sell books. I just literally, I want my dog to be famous.
Well,
he's not attractive, but he's very talented. So I think he doesn't get the attention he deserves.
Well, there you go.
That's not him.
Sorry, next week in this spot, we have Amy Bloom.
Oh, good.
Yes, very much looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. But thank you, Anne Leary. You're fun to talk to, and I think everybody learned something, and it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Bye, everybody.
Record.